So we are now going to look at Dr. Seward's diary from the 28th to the 29th of September, and we are picking up exactly where we left off at the end of the last video. So make sure you're making your annotations, and straight after you've done this, get out that revision sheet and do your reflections in it, because you know, the ideas will be fresh in your mind. So at the end of his previous diary entry, Seward had started to give credit to Van Helsing's interpretation of Lucy's state. However, in the morning, having had a good night's sleep, Seward is now starting to second guess himself. This is clear in the declarative. I wonder if his mind can have become in any way unhinged. Surely there must be some rational explanation for all these mysterious things. So those two sentences introduce a semantic field of madness within that paragraph. Unhinged, off his head, mad. Those three choices indicate to you that he's starting to think maybe Van Helsing has gone crazy. He also posits the notion that potentially Van Helsing could have done this all himself. He might have taken Lucy out of the grave and put her back in there for a bit of a joke. He starts to become suspicious of Van Helsing. He says, I shall watch him carefully. So you can see that the very idea of Lucy becoming a threat, of a beautiful woman becoming powerful, is something that he just can't accept. And it's not just him. The next day, there is a meeting. Arthur and Quincy go to Van Helsing's room. Seward is there. And at this point, Van Helsing wishes to go to the churchyard. There's a request, and Van Helsing is not understood. You can see there's 3 iterations of idioms on this slide. I'm about as up a tree to any meaning about anything. And then a little bit later, Quincy, I don't quite see his drift. And then Arthur, I don't quite like to buy a pig in a poke. All of these idiomatic phrases, or certainly the first 2, indicate to you that Quincy and Arthur don't really understand what it is that Van Helsing is asking of them. And the idiom to buy a pig in a poke means to essentially buy into something before you understand the consequences of it. So Van Helsing he's asking them to trust him. I want your permission to do what I think good this night. That declarative is really ambiguous. What I think good is a very ambiguous description of what he wants to do, which is decapitating Lucy. Arthur is only willing to say that he will accept Van Helsing's actions if they don't violate either his honour as a gentleman at the bottom of the slide or his faith as a Christian. And those 2 phrases, you've got syntactic parallelism there because they're both structured in the same way, those 2 phrases. The syntactic parallelism there is used to show you why these people are the protagonists, the good guys, the heroes, because they have morality, because they have a code for what's right and what's wrong, because they're civilized, because they have class, and therefore they're not savage, they're not evil. Obviously, what Van Helsing's asking them to do is savage, but he's arguing to them that it's not unchristian or ungentlemanly. There is a deliberate tension to this particular diary entry, whereby Van Helsing reveals piecemeal, bit by bit, what he wants to do. So he says, I want you to go with me to the churchyard, and then I want to enter the tomb, and then to open the coffin. So you can see bit by bit he's revealing what he wants to do, and he's not got to the the brutal truth yet. Arthur's reaction is one which reminds us of the Gothic genre's roots in Romanticism. He responds to the idea of opening up the coffin of Lucy with the exclamative, "This is too much," and the adverb, "angrily." And then he's described as choked with indignation, and that verb choked implies he's almost dying with his anger and his anguish. And that, in fact, you know, the abstract noun anguish is used at the bottom of this slide too. Van Helsing's rationalisation for why he wants to open the coffin of Lucy is that our feet must tread in thorny paths, i.e. what we're going to do is going to hurt us, it's going to sting us. Or later and forever, the feet you love must walk in paths of flame. So again, we're using syntactic parallelism, the feet treading paths, the feet walking paths. You can see that there's a repeated structure there in those two clauses that I've highlighted in orange. But what we're learning here is the consequences. If they don't do what Van Helsing says is right and tread that thorny path that might hurt them, then the results are that the feet Arthur loves will walk in paths of flame, i.e. Lucy will go to hell. So this is a fight for her soul. The stakes are raised with that particular exclamative that I've highlighted in orange. At this point, we need to understand why he wants to open up the coffin, and he points out, "If she be not dead." And he can't even finish this particular sentence because immediately Arthur is again filled with emotion. "Good God," he cried, "what do you mean? Has there been any mistake? Has she been buried alive?" He's groaning in anguish. So that sequence of two interrogatives tells you there's a desperate love and passion within that character. But also it tells you Van Helsing's perceptiveness. So previously, this is exactly what he thought Arthur would do. He would assume that she's been buried alive. He would assume that a mistake has happened. So we can see that Van Helsing knows Arthur through and through, just like a father would. Having been interrupted by the emotional Arthur, Van Helsing has to restate his position. "I did not say she was alive, my child." That final noun phrase connotes to you that he's trying to be as gentle as he possibly can with Arthur, and it infers for us the idea of his paternalism, his fatherliness. But then at the end of that particular direct speech, he uses that compound adjective, undead. This is interesting because if we were to use that adjective today, we wouldn't put the hyphen in there. Because it's a word that's used quite often. Undead is a neologism. It's like a new word that's being used here, and therefore it still has that hyphen. Just an interesting linguistic point. Language changes over time, language morphology. Anyway, Arthur responds with a sequence of exclamatives and interrogatives because you have to imagine he's deeply kind of angry and upset at this point. "Undead? Not alive? What do you mean? Is this all a nightmare or what is it?" Obviously the allusion to nightmare brings to mind the fact this is the Gothic genre. It makes us think of sleep-like and death-like states. It reminds us of the fact that Lucy is forced into vampirism in a state of trance, like she's sleepwalking. And it also calls to mind the very opening of Seward's diary entry in this part of the chapter, where he starts to think about, you know, is Van Helsing mad? Because Arthur feels like he's mad. He feels like this is a nightmare. It's at this point, I can't help but find this sort of peculiarly comic. It's at this point that Van Helsing asks, "May I cut off the head of dead Miss Lucy?" That interrogative is just so abrupt, and therefore, obviously, the response of Arthur is deeply emotional. And again, this is where we can see the romantic roots of the Gothic genre. Heavens and earth know, he has a storm of passion, that metaphor conveying to you the depth of his feelings for her. He describes himself as being tortured. Again, that verb showing depth of feeling and his huge capacity for love towards Lucy. He can't believe that that is something that Van Helsing would want to do. He asks the interrogative, are you mad that you speak such things, or am I mad to listen to them? And again, that question of reliable narrators, unreliable narrators, reliable characters, unreliable characters is very useful for generating tension in Gothic novels. Arthur says, I have a duty to do in protecting her grave from outrage, and by God, I shall do it. So he says here, as a fiancé, he's obligated to protect Lucy's body and to protect her coffin. But Van Helsing points out that there's more at stake here than Lucy's respect or Lucy's dignity. I too have a duty to do, a duty to others, a duty to you, a duty to the dead, and by God, I shall do it. You can see clearly there that these two characters are using syntactic parallelism, but specifically it's Van Helsing. He uses Arthur's utterance and he flings it back at him, but with this anaphora, a duty to others, a duty to you, a duty to the dead. And therefore we start to realise that more people could be hurt. Those are the consequences of not allowing Van Helsing to do his duty. And it is with this impassioned speech that Arthur eventually decides that he can't understand Van Helsing's perspective. It's not something that's clear to him, but he will go with him. So he's not given permission for the head to be chopped off at this stage, but he has given permission for to go with Van Helsing, to go with Seward, and to visit Lucy in her coffin once more. So we can see there's quite a cyclical nature to this chapter and to the start of the next chapter, where we are repeatedly visiting the churchyard, looking for signs of undead life, if you like, looking for evidence, all building up to the climactic decapitation of Lucy and the kind of first victory for the forces of good. But what's really peculiar is that that first victory is a violent persecution of a sexualized woman.